Case 1. Craig Price, 13 years old. That's how young Craig Price was when he first took a life. In the quiet Buttonwoods neighborhood of Warwick, Rhode Island, residents knew each other by name. They watched each other's children grow up, borrowed tools from one another, and never imagined that one of their own could harbor something monstrous. But on the night of July 27th, 1987, that illusion shattered forever. Craig Price, barely a teenager, slipped into the home of 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer, grabbed a knife from her own kitchen, and stabbed her 58 times. She died alone in her home, just 2 houses away from where Price lived with his family. The crime scene horrified investigators. The level of violence was extreme, personal, and brutal. Yet despite extensive searches, police found no suspect. The case went cold, tucked away in filing cabinets, while the community tried to move forward. But Price wasn't finished. The evil inside him was only dormant, waiting. 2 years later, on the night of September 1st, 1989, Price struck again. This time, he was 15 years old, a freshman in high school living an ordinary teenage life on the surface. But that night, he consumed marijuana and substances that stripped away whatever thin restraint he might have possessed. He targeted the Heaton family, who lived nearby on Metropolitan Drive. Joan Heaton, a 39-year-old mother, was home with her 2 daughters, 10-year-old Jennifer and 8-year-old Melissa. Price entered their home through an unlocked window. What happened next would become one of the most horrific family annihilations in Rhode Island history. Joan Heaton was stabbed 57 times. Her daughter Jennifer suffered 62 stab wounds. Young Melissa was not only stabbed 30 times, but had her skull crushed with a kitchen stool. The violence was so severe that the knives Price used broke off at the handles, embedded in the bodies of his victims. When Marie Bouchard, Joan's mother, arrived at the house on September 4th, after not hearing from her daughter over the Labor Day weekend, she and her other daughter, Mary Lou, discovered the unthinkable. Blood splattered the interior. A putrid smell hung in the air. The scene was beyond comprehension. Warwick police immediately launched an intensive investigation. The similarities between the Heaton murders and Rebecca Spencer's unsolved death 2 years earlier were unmistakable. The Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the case, profiling the perpetrator as someone local, someone who knew the neighborhood intimately. Then came the breakthrough. Investigators noticed that whoever committed the Heaton murders had injured themselves during the attack. When detectives Ray Pendergast and Mark Brandreth canvassed the area on September 5th, just 1 day after the bodies were discovered, they interviewed Craig Price. He had a fresh cut on his hand. Price offered an excuse, claiming he'd injured himself while drunk and vandalizing a car. But the detectives weren't convinced. They requested a search warrant. Inside Price's family home, they discovered bloody knives and clothing. The evidence was overwhelming. On September 17th, 1989, with his mother present, Price was interrogated at the Warwick police station. And then, calmly, without visible remorse, he confessed. He admitted to murdering the Heaton family. He described entering their home intending to steal a VCR, encountering Joan when she awoke, and then killing everyone in the house. He even mimicked the dying sounds of the young girls he had stabbed. Under continued questioning, he also confessed to Rebecca Spencer's murder 2 years prior. But here's where the story takes an infuriating turn. Craig Price was arrested on September 16th, just 1 month before his 16th birthday. Under Rhode Island law at the time, anyone under 16 who committed a crime, no matter how severe, had to be tried as a juvenile. And juvenile offenders, by law, could only be held until their 21st birthday. Price knew this. During his confession, he bragged that he would be released at 21 and would make history. He understood that the legal system had no mechanism to keep him locked up past that date. For killing 4 people, he faced a maximum of 5 years in detention. Public outrage was immediate and volcanic. The families of the victims were devastated. The community felt betrayed by a justice system that seemed powerless to deliver appropriate consequences. A grassroots organization called Citizens Opposed to the Release of Craig Price, known as CORP, formed almost overnight. Led by Captain Kevin Collins, who had supervised the Heaton investigation, and Marie Bouchard, Joan Heaton's mother. CORP organized protests, hired airplanes to fly banners across major cities, warning that Killer Craig Price might be moving to their neighborhoods, and lobbied relentlessly for legislative change. The case attracted national attention. Even President Bill Clinton weighed in during a visit to Rhode Island, advocating for changes to the law. In response, The Rhode Island legislature passed new legislation allowing juveniles to be tried in adult court for serious crimes. But the law could not be applied retroactively. Price had beaten the system, or so it seemed. Law enforcement and prosecutors refused to give up. They began building a new strategy: keep Price incarcerated on additional charges committed while he was in custody. In late 1993, while detained at the Rhode Island Training School, Price threatened a guard who was writing him up for smuggling cigarettes. He wasn't accustomed to accountability. This incident became the first domino. In 1994, Price was convicted of extortion and assault for threatening the correctional officer. He received a 15-year sentence with 7 years to serve. The Attorney General then initiated criminal contempt proceedings against him for refusing to participate in a mandatory psychiatric program. A jury convicted him, adding 25 years to his sentence, with 10 to serve. But Price's violent behavior continued. He fought with correctional officers in 1996, stomped on another officer in 1998, and assaulted an inmate in 2001. Each incident added more time to his sentence. By 2004, his notoriety and violent tendencies led Rhode Island authorities to transfer him to Florida, where he would serve the remainder of his sentence far from the state he had terrorized. Even there, the violence didn't stop. In July 2009, Price was involved in a prison fight with another inmate. While officers attempted to break up the altercation, one correctional officer was stabbed in the finger by a homemade weapon in Price's possession. Then, in April 2017, he was accused of stabbing fellow inmate Joshua Davis at the Suwannee Correctional Institution with a 5-inch homemade knife. In 2019, Price was convicted of that stabbing and received an additional 25-year sentence. The parole board denied his release in March 2009, and again in subsequent hearings. His projected release date has been pushed back repeatedly. The Rhode Island Attorney General's office has filed probation violation charges related to his Florida offenses, ensuring that even if he completes his Florida sentence, he will be returned to Rhode Island to face additional time. Craig Price remains incarcerated today, now in his 50s. He is recognized as America's youngest serial killer, a title that carries unimaginable weight. The legal maneuvering that kept him locked up after his juvenile sentence expired has become a case study in criminal justice, illustrating both the failures and the resourcefulness of a system trying to protect the public from a remorseless predator. The victims' families have never received closure, but they have seen justice delayed is not justice denied. Price's story changed Rhode Island law forever, reshaping how the state handles violent juvenile offenders. But for the families of Rebecca Spencer, Joan Heaton, Jennifer Heaton, and Melissa Heaton, no legal reform can ever undo the horror of what happened in those quiet Warwick homes. And as you'll soon learn, Price wasn't the only person whose crimes would force Rhode Island to confront darkness hiding in plain sight. Case 2, Esteban Carpio. Some crimes happen in an instant, a split-second decision that changes everything forever. On April 16, 2005, Providence, Rhode Island, was about to witness one of the most shocking acts of violence in the city's history. Esteban Carpio, a 26-year-old man with a troubled past and a history of petty offenses, was about to commit an act so brazen, so unthinkable, that it would send shockwaves through the entire law enforcement community. It began in the early afternoon when Carpio, driving a red van, approached 84-year-old Madeline Gatta as she stood in front of her home on Swift Street. Dressed in black with his face concealed by a scarf and hat, Carpio attempted to rob her. When she began crying for help, he struck her forcefully in the upper back, causing her to collapse. She felt a sharp pain, later discovered to be stab wounds. Carpio fled on foot, then escaped in the van. But an alert neighbor managed to note the vehicle's registration number before he disappeared. Police responded quickly. They traced the van back to Carpio and brought him in for questioning at Providence Police Headquarters. He was taken to a third-floor interview room where Detective Sergeant James Allen, a 50-year-old veteran with 27 years of service, began the interrogation. Allen was married, a father of 2 daughters, and deeply respected within the department. He was known for his professionalism, his calm demeanor under pressure, and his dedication to the community he served. That afternoon, he was doing what he had done hundreds of times before, interviewing a suspect in a serious crime. At some point during the interrogation, another detective left the room to retrieve water for Carpio. It was a routine moment, a brief absence that should have meant nothing. But in those few seconds, everything changed. Carpio and Detective Allen were alone. Exactly what transpired next is known only through the physical evidence and witness accounts from officers who responded moments later. A violent struggle erupted. Carpio managed to disarm Detective Allen, seizing his service weapon from its holster. Then, without hesitation, Carpio fired multiple shots into Allen's back and face at close range. The sound of gunfire echoed through the building. Officers on the floor below heard the shots. They attempted to communicate with Detective Allen over the radio. Silence. They rushed toward the third-floor conference room, hearing additional gunshots as they approached. When they finally breached the door using a battering ram, after 3 attempts, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. Detective Allen lay mortally wounded on the floor. Carpio was gone. The room was in complete disarray, bullet casings scattered, blood pooling. It wasn't until officers entered an adjoining office that they realized how Carpio had escaped. He had shot out a window and jumped from the 3rd floor. A massive manhunt began immediately. Carpio, injured from his fall, was found 45 minutes later after a foot chase. When officers apprehended him, he resisted violently, and Rhode Island State Police Detective Christopher Zarella later testified that he punched Carpio in the face 3 times during the arrest, breaking bones in his face. The injuries were severe, visible, and shocking. Carpio's face was swollen and bruised, his features barely recognizable. Detective Allen was rushed to Rhode Island Hospital, but the wounds were too severe. He was pronounced deceased at 12:29 in the morning on April 17, 2005. A husband, a father, a public servant who had dedicated his life to protecting others was gone. The Providence Police Department mourned. The entire state mourned. Carpio was arraigned the next day, April 18th, appearing in Providence District Court to face first-degree charges related to Detective Allen's death. But what captured national attention wasn't just the crime, it was Carpio's appearance. His face was so badly injured that he was forced to wear a plastic mask during the proceedings to prevent him from spitting at officers and to cover the extent of his facial trauma. The images of Carpio in that mask spread across news outlets nationwide, igniting a fierce debate about police use of force during arrests. Providence Police Chief Dean Esserman stated that Carpio's injuries resulted from his jump from the 3rd-floor window. Detective Zarella's testimony about punching Carpio during the arrest added complexity to the narrative. An investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation ultimately concluded that police did not use excessive force, but the court of public opinion remained divided. Some argued that Carpio, who had just taken the life of a police officer, deserved no sympathy. Others raised concerns about the severity of his injuries and whether proper protocols had been followed. On December 9, 2005, a grand jury returned indictments against Carpio, charging him with 200 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 100 for criminal negligence, and 100 for committing a crime of violence resulting in death. He was also charged with the stabbing of Madeline Gatta. Carpio's defense team built their case around an insanity defense, arguing that he suffered from chronic mental illness and drug-induced psychosis, rendering him unable to understand the wrongfulness of his actions at the time of the offense. The trial began in June 2006. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence. Ballistic matches confirming Allen's weapon was used, blood spatter patterns consistent with the sequence of shots fired, Carpio's fingerprints on the gun, and testimony from Detective Stephen McGann, who heard Allen's cries for help. They argued that Carpio's actions demonstrated calculation and intent, not mental incapacity. They pointed to his prior stabbing of Madeline Gatta as evidence of criminal agency, his deliberate disarming of Allen without warning, and his subsequent evasion during the manhunt. In their view, this was not the behavior of someone incapable of understanding right from wrong. The defense countered with psychiatric evaluations and testimony suggesting Carpio had a documented history of mental health struggles and substance dependence. They claimed he lacked the mental capacity to form the intent required for first-degree charges. But on June 27, 2006, the jury rejected the insanity defense. They found Esteban Carpio guilty on all counts: the first-degree offense of taking the life of a police officer, discharging a firearm while committing a violent act, and the assault on Madeline Gatta. On October 10, 2006, Carpio was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Detective Allen's death, an additional consecutive life sentence for committing violence with a firearm resulting in death, and a consecutive 20-year term for the assault on the elderly woman. He would never walk free again. Carpio appealed his conviction multiple times. In 2012, the Rhode Island Supreme Court denied his appeal, stating that his lawyers had strategically chosen not to pursue a new trial and that the trial court had acted appropriately. In 2017, he filed a petition in federal court, arguing that the jury wrongfully convicted him because he lacked criminal responsibility due to mental illness. U.S. District Court Judge John McConnell Jr. dismissed the lawsuit in 2017, rejecting Carpio's claims. All subsequent appeals have been denied. Carpio currently serves his sentence at McDougall Walker Correctional Institution in Connecticut, transferred out of Rhode Island due to security concerns. The case of Esteban Carpio remains one of the most traumatic events in Providence law enforcement history. It exposed vulnerabilities in interrogation procedures and sparked nationwide discussions about officer safety during suspect interviews. The Providence Police Department implemented new protocols in the wake of the tragedy, ensuring that officers are never left alone with potentially violent suspects during questioning. For the family of Detective James Allen, no verdict, no sentence, no legal outcome could ever restore what was taken from them. But justice, however imperfect, was served. Carpio will spend the rest of his life behind bars, a consequence of the choice he made in that third-floor room on April 16, 2005. And in a state still processing its grief over one senseless act, another family was about to disappear, under circumstances even more disturbing. Case 3. Christopher Hightower. He was the kind of man people trusted. Christopher Hightower was a 42-year-old commodities broker living in the affluent community of Barrington, Rhode Island. To his neighbors, he was a pillar of the community, a Sunday school teacher, a youth soccer coach, a friendly face at local events. Parents let their children play under his supervision. Church members listened to his lessons on morality and faith. On the surface, his life seemed stable, respectable, even admirable. But beneath that carefully constructed image, everything was falling apart. And when it did, Hightower wouldn't just self-destruct. He would take 3 innocent people with him. By September 1991, Hightower's world was collapsing. His wife, Susan, wanted a divorce. During one heated argument, he told her something chilling. He had paid someone $5,000 to take her life, with an extra $1,000 to make it look accidental. He also threatened her parents and her sister, warning that contracts had been placed on them as well if they tried to take custody of the couple's 2 children. Terrified, Susan sought a restraining order from the Rhode Island Family Court to have him removed from her parents' home, where they had been living. The once respected community figure was now a man unraveling, his threats growing darker by the day. At the same time, Hightower faced professional ruin. Ernest Brendel, a 53-year-old self-employed patent and trademark attorney, had filed a formal complaint against Hightower with the National Futures Association and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. Brendel, who had once been Hightower's friend and client, accused him of mismanaging a $12,000 foreign currency investment and making material misrepresentations. The complaint sought revocation of Hightower's license as a trading advisor. If successful, it would end his career. Hightower's financial situation was already dire, and losing his license would be the final blow. He couldn't let that happen. On September 19, 1991, Hightower walked into a sporting goods store and purchased a Bear Devastator crossbow, 6 arrows, and 6 bullet point tips. The crossbow was powerful enough to take down a bear. The next day, September 20th, he put his plan into action. Alice Brendel, Ernest's 49-year-old wife, and a librarian at Brown University, was last seen that Friday evening, riding the bus home from Providence. She arrived at the couple's home on Middle Highway in Barrington, where she lived with Ernest and their 8-year-old daughter, Emily, a bright 3rd grader at Primrose Hill Elementary School. What happened next would haunt the community for decades. Hightower entered the Brendel property, likely through the garage, and waited. When Ernest arrived, Hightower ambushed him. Using the crossbow, he shot Ernest 5 times with steel-tipped arrows. One of those arrows pierced his heart, causing fatal trauma. Alice, who had been drugged and was sleeping, was strangled with her own scarf. And Emily, the innocent 8-year-old child, who had done nothing but exist in the wrong place at the wrong time, was forced to ingest a lethal overdose of sleeping pills. She was then buried alive in a shallow grave. The level of cruelty was incomprehensible. After committing the acts, Hightower took steps to cover his tracks. He drove the Brendel family's car, now bloodstained and containing Ernest Brendel's teeth, and used the family computer to forge documents. On September 22nd, he printed a letter on Ernest Brendel's letterhead, purporting to be from Ernest himself, withdrawing the complaint filed with the National Futures Association. He mailed it to the regulatory agency. He also forged a check for $1,500 from the Brendels' joint account, payable to himself. Then, in a brazen attempt to extort money, Hightower drove to Guilford, Connecticut, on the night of September 22nd, and visited the home of Christine Scriabine, Ernest Brendel's sister. He told Scriabine a fabricated story. The Brendel family had been taken by an unidentified person, and he needed $75,000 to pay a ransom. Scriabine, suspicious of Hightower's demeanor and the inconsistencies in his story, refused to pay and immediately contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Within hours, law enforcement was tracking Hightower. On September 23rd, police officers spotted him driving the Brendels' blood-stained vehicle. Inside, they found the crossbow, a shotgun, and Ernest Brendel's teeth. Hightower was arrested on weapons charges, stolen property violations, and attempted extortion. But where were the Brendels? That question haunted investigators and the community for 7 agonizing weeks. Search teams scoured the area. Volunteers combed through wooded areas near the Brendel home. Bloodhounds tracked scents through fields and forests. Yet the family remained missing. Hightower, now in custody, refused to cooperate. At one point, Sergeant John Lazaro of the Barrington Police told Hightower he was leaving to check tire tracks near his residence. Hightower's response was chilling. "Sarge, you're wasting your time. They are not buried there." It was an admission of knowledge he shouldn't have possessed if he were innocent. Finally, on November 7th, 1991, a woman named Catherine McCloy was walking her dogs in a wooded area near St. Andrew's School, just off Middle Highway in Barrington, less than a half-mile from the Brendel home. One of her dogs ran into the bushes and refused to return when called. McCloy followed and found the dog sniffing at 2 depressions in the ground, with a small amount of white powder nearby. Having gardening experience, McCloy recognized the powder as lime. She called the police. Later that day, investigators excavated the site. The bodies of Ernest, Alice, and Emily Brendel were found buried in shallow, lime-lined graves. The discovery devastated the community. Rhode Island Attorney General James O'Neill, visibly shaken, addressed the media. "Our hearts and souls reach out to the relatives of the Brendel family and the people of this community," he said. The tragedy united the state in grief, but it also ignited rage. How could someone so trusted, so integrated into the fabric of the community, commit such monstrous acts? On November 19th, 1991, Christopher Hightower was arraigned in Providence District Court. He appeared in shackles, charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Ernest, Alice, and Emily Brendel, along with 1 count of abduction for taking Emily from a YMCA daycare center. Additional charges included breaking and entering, forgery, and unlawful burial. He was ordered held without bail. The trial began in March 1993. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: the crossbow purchase, the forged documents, the stolen car, the attempted extortion, and Hightower's own incriminating statements to police. His former father-in-law, Clyde Slicker, testified that Hightower had stayed out all night on September 19th, returning home around 11 in the morning on September 20th, wet and covered with mud. His eyeglasses were bent, his legs scraped. He immediately showered and put his dirty clothes in the washing machine, asking Slicker to add bleach, the first time Slicker had ever seen him do laundry. Susan Hightower, his ex-wife, testified about the threats he had made against her life just days before the Brendels' disappearance. The jury heard how Hightower's personal and professional life had been unraveling, how he faced financial ruin and the loss of his license, how Ernest Brendel's complaint could have ended everything for him. The defense offered no substantial counter-narrative. The evidence was insurmountable. On April 7th, 1993, the jury found Christopher Hightower guilty on all 11 counts. On June 8th, 1993, Providence Superior Court Judge John Sheehan sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms in prison. Hightower received life without the possibility of parole for the deaths of Ernest and Emily Brendel, and a 3rd life sentence for Alice Brendel's death. Sheehan called the acts the most abhorrent evil he had ever encountered. All 3 sentences were ordered to run consecutively, ensuring Hightower would never see freedom again. He also received at least 5 years on each of the remaining counts, including breaking and entering and illegal burial. In 1993, Hightower was transferred out of Rhode Island to serve his sentence in another state due to security concerns and his notoriety within the community. He remains incarcerated today, decades later, a man whose fall from grace was as complete as it was horrifying. The Brendel murders reshaped how Rhode Island viewed trust, safety, and the idea that evil could hide behind a Sunday school teacher's smile. And while Hightower's crimes were premeditated and personal, another tragedy was about to unfold that would devastate an entire community in a matter of minutes. Case 4. Jeffrey and Michael Derderian. It was supposed to be a night of music, laughter, and escape. On the evening of February 20th, 2003, the Station Nightclub in West Warwick, Rhode Island, was packed with concertgoers eager to see the rock band Great White perform. The venue, a single-story wood-framed building with a footprint of about 4,484 square feet, had been a fixture in the community for years. Originally built as a gin mill in 1946, it had served as a restaurant, tavern, and pub before being converted into a nightclub in the early 1990s. In March 2000, brothers Jeffrey and Michael Derderian purchased the property, renaming it The Station and maintaining its use as a live music venue. That night, between 440 and 462 people crowded into the club, exceeding its licensed capacity of 404. The atmosphere was electric. Fans pressed close to the stage, drinks in hand, ready for the show. Just after 11 p.m., Great White took the stage. The opening notes began, and then, in an instant, everything changed. Daniel Biccola, the band's tour manager, set off 4 large pyrotechnics, called gerbs, as part of the show's opening spectacle. Sparks shot into the air, igniting the polyurethane foam insulation that lined the walls and ceiling around the stage. The foam, installed by the Derderian brothers to dampen sound and reduce noise complaints from neighbors, was highly flammable. Within seconds, flames raced along the ceiling above the dance floor. Smoke became visible in the exit doorways in little more than 1 minute. Many in the crowd initially thought the fire was part of the performance. They didn't move. They didn't react. By the time panic set in, the situation was already catastrophic. The building had 4 exits: the main entrance on the north side, a door adjacent to the stage on the west end, a door near the bar on the east end, and an exit through the kitchen. But the overwhelming majority of concertgoers instinctively rushed toward the main entrance, the door they had entered through. It was a narrow hallway with a single interior door, and as hundreds of people converged on that space simultaneously, a deadly bottleneck formed, bodies pressed against bodies. People screamed, smoke thickened, turning visibility to 0 within 90 seconds. Flames broke through a portion of the roof in less than 5 minutes. Those trapped inside had almost no time to escape. Jeffrey Derderian, who was working at the bar that night, grabbed a fire extinguisher and ran toward the stage with another employee. "We tried to get as far as we could," he later recalled. "We couldn't make it. The heat was too intense, the smoke too thick." Outside, survivor Linda Saran described the scene as a riptide, a surge of bodies toward the exit. An investigation by the Providence Journal later found that people inside had just 102 seconds to escape before conditions became unsurvivable. Thick black smoke filled the club after 90 seconds, trapping dozens inside. The entire building was engulfed in flames within 15 minutes. Firefighters arrived within 4 minutes of the first 911 call, but by then the situation was beyond saving. Rescuers pulled people from the wreckage, but many were already gone. When the smoke finally cleared, 100 people were deceased. 230 others were injured, many suffering from severe burns, smoke inhalation, and trauma from being trampled in the crush. It was the 4th deadliest nightclub fire in United States history. The aftermath was immediate and devastating. Families gathered at hospitals, desperately searching for loved ones. The Rhode Island community, small and tightly knit, was shattered. There was no place in the state more than an hour away by car, and almost everyone knew someone affected by the tragedy. Vigils were held. Memorials sprang up at the site where the station once stood. And as grief gave way to anger, attention turned to accountability. How did this happen? Who was responsible? On February 26, 2003, Rhode Island Attorney General Patrick Lynch initiated a grand jury investigation. Over the following months, evidence was gathered, witnesses interviewed, and expert testimony compiled. On December 9, 2003, the grand jury returned indictments against 3 individuals: Daniel Bickel, the tour manager who set off the pyrotechnics, and Jeffrey and Michael Derderian, the owners of the station. Each was charged with 200 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 100 for criminal negligence, and 100 for committing a misdemeanor resulting in death. The charges centered on multiple failures. Bickel had ignited the pyrotechnics without proper authorization and without ensuring the venue was safe for such effects. There was significant dispute about whether he had permission from the club to use the fireworks. The Derderians maintained they had a detailed contract with the band that specifically prohibited pyrotechnics. "These contracts are pretty specific," Michael Derderian later stated. "The pyrotechnic provision would be in there, just like we need to have 12 M&Ms, and they need to be brown." But the prosecution focused heavily on the foam. Lynch's investigation found that the polyurethane foam installed by the Derderians was not only against code, but essentially solid gasoline. When ignited, it burned rapidly and released toxic smoke. The Derderians later claimed they had ordered soundproofing foam, but didn't realize they had received flammable packing foam instead. Critics found this defense difficult to believe. Additionally, the building lacked a sprinkler system, a deficiency allowed under grandfathered code provisions from when the structure was originally built. Fire safety experts testified that a functioning sprinkler system would have dramatically altered the outcome. Another critical issue was the exits. Inspection records showed that just 3 months before the fire, the Derderians had been cited by the local fire marshal for having a secondary interior door by the stage that opened inward, violating regulations. They were instructed to remove it. But on the night of the fire, the door was not only present, it was covered in foam and blocked by flames. That door being up, there is no question that increased the likelihood that many, many more would perish, Lynch stated. The fire marshal who had inspected the station in the months before the fire, Dennis LaRocque, was not charged. Rhode Island law granted immunity from criminal prosecution to fire marshals for actions made in good faith performance of their duties. LaRocque claimed he had not seen the foam during the November 2002 inspection because he was upset after finding the illegal inward swinging door. The Derderians questioned this publicly. Why is it okay that the fire marshal is allowed to miss something or make a mistake, and what he did was just an oops, but what we did was criminal? Rather than face trial, all 3 defendants accepted plea deals. Daniel Bickel pleaded guilty to 100 counts of misdemeanor manslaughter. He expressed deep remorse, appearing crushed by the weight of what had occurred. Some families of the victims supported leniency for him, believing his contrition was genuine. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, with 11 years suspended and 3 years of probation. He was released in 2008. Jeffrey and Michael Derderian pleaded no contest to 100 counts of misdemeanor manslaughter, avoiding a jury trial. The state allowed the brothers to decide amongst themselves which one would serve prison time. Michael Derderian received the same sentence as Bickel, 4 years in prison, and was released in 2009 after serving approximately 2 years and 9 months. Jeffrey Derderian received a 10-year suspended sentence, 3 years of probation, and 500 hours of community service. He did not serve prison time. Civil lawsuits followed, resulting in a recovery of $176 million for victims and families. The state of Rhode Island and the town of West Warwick each agreed to pay $10 million due to negligence in fire marshal performance. Club owners Jeffrey and Michael Derderian reached a settlement of $813,000. Sealed Air Corporation agreed to pay $25 million, as their polyethylene foam had been installed at the station in the drummer's alcove behind the soundproofing foam, producing toxic gas when it burned. Providence television station, WPRI-TV, and their then owners, Lanolin TV, settled for $30 million, as their video journalist, Brian Butler, was accused of obstructing escape routes while filming. The fire led to sweeping changes in fire safety regulations nationwide. Within weeks of the tragedy, the National Fire Protection Association called an emergency meeting, resulting in multiple tentative interim amendments passed on July 26, 2003. New requirements included sprinkler systems for all nightclub-type facilities, with occupant loads greater than 100, crowd managers for all assembly occupancies, restrictions on festival seating, and mandatory means of egress inspections with record-keeping. Rhode Island passed laws banning pyrotechnics in venues holding fewer than 300 people. and requiring sprinkler systems in clubs with capacities exceeding 150. In May 2017, the Station Fire Memorial Park was opened at the site where the nightclub once stood, honoring all 100 victims. Every February 20th, survivors, families, and community members gather to remember those lost. For many, the emotional wounds remain as raw as they were that night. Linda Sarin, who suffered second and third-degree burns to 34% of her body, spent weeks in a medically induced coma and endured painful rehabilitation. To this day, scars cover her body, a constant reminder of the fire. She has publicly stated she has yet to forgive the Derderians, believing they have never fully accepted responsibility. Jeffrey and Michael Derderian gave their first in-depth television interview about the fire in October 2021, appearing on CBS's 48 Hours. They wanted to set the record straight and reveal new information, including their claim that critical evidence had been withheld from them. They maintained they were unaware of the pyrotechnics and believed they had done everything reasonably possible to operate a safe club. Yet for many of the families, no explanation will ever be sufficient. Their loved ones went out for a concert and never came home. The Station Nightclub Fire stands as one of Rhode Island's darkest chapters. It was a confluence of failures, flammable materials, overcrowding, inadequate exits, lack of sprinklers, that turned a night of celebration into mass tragedy. The fire changed not just Rhode Island, but the nation, forcing a reckoning with how we balance entertainment with safety. And for the 100 people who perished, the 230 who were injured, and the countless families forever altered, the scars of that night will never fully fade. As devastating as that collective loss was, Rhode Island's next case would show how corruption, not negligence, could also destroy a city from within. Case 5. Vincent Buddy Cianci Jr. Some politicians rise and fall once. Buddy Cianci did it twice. Vincent Buddy Cianci Jr. wasn't just the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island. He was Providence. Charismatic, brash, and larger than life, Cianci held the office for an astonishing 21 years, across 2 separate terms, making him the longest-serving mayor in the city's history. To some, he was a visionary who revitalized a decaying city, transforming Providence into a cultural and economic hub. To others, he was a corrupt politician who abused his power and betrayed the public trust. The truth, as with most of Buddy Cianci's life, was complicated. Born April 30th, 1941, Cianci grew up in an Italian-American family in Cranston, Rhode Island. He attended Moses Brown School, earned a bachelor's degree from Fairfield University, and a law degree from Marquette University. He was smart, ambitious, and politically savvy from a young age. In 1967, he became an assistant attorney general for Rhode Island. By 1969, he was appointed special prosecutor to the state attorney general's anti-corruption strike force. In 1974, at just 33 years old, Cianci was elected mayor of Providence, the youngest person and the first Italian-American to hold the office. His political ascent seemed unstoppable. Cianci's first term as mayor focused on urban renewal. Providence, in the 1970s, was struggling economically, plagued by crime and urban decay. Cianci championed redevelopment projects, improved city services, and cultivated relationships with business leaders. He brought energy and optimism to a city desperately in need of both. By the late 70s, Providence was beginning to turn around. Cianci's popularity soared. Voters re-elected him in 1978 and again in 1982. He was on top of the world. But Buddy Cianci had a temper, and on the night of March 20th, 1983, that temper cost him everything. Raymond DeLeo, a contractor who had worked on city projects, was having an extramarital relationship with Cianci's estranged wife, Sheila. When Cianci learned of the affair, he became consumed with rage. That night, Cianci lured DeLeo to his home under false pretenses. Once inside, Cianci confronted him. What happened next was brutal. Cianci, along with 2 men later identified as Anthony the Saint Laurent, a reputed mob associate, and Dennis McParland, a detective assigned to Cianci's security detail, proceeded to assault DeLeo. According to testimony, Cianci beat DeLeo with a fireplace log, struck him repeatedly with an ashtray, and burned him with a lit cigarette. He also threatened to have DeLeo taken out in a body bag if he didn't end the affair with Sheila. The attack lasted over an hour. DeLeo was eventually allowed to leave, bloodied and traumatized. He went straight to the hospital and then to the police. The charges were filed: kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy. In January 1984, Cianci stood trial. The evidence was damning. DeLeo testified in detail about the beating. Medical records confirmed his injuries. The defense argued that the encounter was consensual, a version of events that strained credulity. On April 15, 1984, the jury convicted Cianci of assault. He was acquitted of the more serious kidnapping and conspiracy charges. Superior Court Judge Thomas Fay sentenced him to 5 years in prison, with all but 1 year suspended. Cianci was also placed on probation for 4 years. On April 25, 1984, he resigned as mayor. But Buddy Cianci wasn't done. His political career should have ended with that conviction. Rhode Island law prohibits anyone convicted of a felony from holding elected office. Yet Cianci found a loophole. His assault conviction was technically a misdemeanor at sentencing due to a legal technicality involving the suspended portion of his sentence. After serving only 4 months behind bars, Cianci was released. He went into radio, hosting a popular talk show. He remained in the public eye, never truly fading away. In 1990, he mounted a comeback campaign for mayor. Against all odds, he won. Cianci's second term began in 1991, and initially, it seemed as if he had learned from his mistakes. He poured himself into revitalizing Providence. Under his leadership, the city underwent a renaissance. He championed the relocation of Interstate 95, uncovering the Providence River and creating Water Place Park. He supported the development of the Providence Place Mall, attracted new businesses, and made the city a destination for tourists and artists. Providence's crime rate dropped, property values increased. Cianci's approval ratings soared. He became a national figure, featured in magazines and news programs as the comeback mayor who saved a city. But behind the scenes, corruption was flourishing. Throughout the 1990s, federal investigators were building a case. The Federal Bureau of Investigation launched an operation dubbed Plunder Dome, investigating allegations of bribery, extortion, and racketeering within Cianci's administration. Wiretaps, surveillance, and informants painted a picture of a city government where political favors were bought and sold, where contracts were awarded based on kickbacks rather than merit, and where the mayor's office operated like a criminal enterprise. On April 2, 2001, a B federal grand jury returned an indictment against Cianci and several of his associates. The charges included conspiracy to commit racketeering, extortion, witness tampering, and mail fraud. Prosecutors alleged that Cianci presided over a corrupt administration where city leases, jobs, contracts, and other benefits were provided in exchange for bribes and campaign contributions. One particularly damaging allegation involved a university club lease. Cianci allegedly demanded a $15,000 bribe in exchange for approving the lease. The bribe was delivered in cash, wrapped inside a cigar box at Cianci's home. Cianci denied all wrongdoing. He claimed he was being unfairly targeted by federal prosecutors with a political agenda. He insisted the charges were based on the testimony of convicted criminals and disgruntled former employees seeking leniency. But the evidence continued to mount. Witnesses testified about cash payments, secret meetings, and a culture of corruption that permeated City Hall. Recorded conversations revealed discussions about money changing hands in exchange for city actions. The trial began in February 2002 and lasted 5 months. It was one of the most high-profile political corruption cases in Rhode Island history. Prosecutors presented dozens of witnesses and thousands of pages of documents. The defense argued that while some of Cianci's associates may have been corrupt, the mayor himself had no direct knowledge of their actions. On June 25, 2002, the jury returned a mixed verdict. Cianci was acquitted of 26 charges, including bribery and extortion. But on one count, conspiracy to commit racketeering, he was found guilty. On September 6, 2002, U.S. District Judge Ernest Torres sentenced Vincent Buddy Cianci Jr. to 5 years and 4 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He was also ordered to pay fines and restitution. On December 7, 2002, Cianci surrendered to authorities and began serving his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Fort Dix, New Jersey. His political career was over. Cianci was released from prison in May 2007 after serving 4.5 years. He returned to Rhode Island and once again entered broadcasting, hosting a radio show on WPRO. He published a memoir titled Politics and Pasta, reflecting on his tumultuous career. Despite his criminal record, Cianci remained a beloved figure to many Providence residents who credited him with the city's transformation. In 2014, he announced he would run for mayor again. The campaign generated national attention. Could Buddy Cianci, twice disgraced, win a third time? He couldn't. In November 2014, Cianci lost the election to Democrat Jorge Elorza. It was the final chapter of his political life. On January 28, 2016, Vincent Buddy Cianci Jr. passed away from colon cancer at the age of 74. Thousands attended his funeral. Flags across Providence were lowered to half-staff. Tributes poured in from across the political spectrum. Love him or hate him, Buddy Cianci had been an undeniable force in Rhode Island politics for over 4 decades. His legacy remains deeply contested. Supporters point to the Providence Renaissance, the vibrant arts scene, the revitalized downtown. Critics point to the corruption, the abuse of power, the betrayal of public trust. Cianci himself once said, "I never met a legal dollar I didn't like." That remark, delivered with his trademark humor, captured the essence of his complicated life. A man who could charm, inspire, and infuriate all at once. Buddy Cianci's story is a quintessentially American tale of ambition, redemption, and moral compromise. He rose higher than almost any politician in Rhode Island history, and he fell harder, twice. And yet, even in disgrace, he remained a figure of fascination, a reminder that in politics, as in life, heroes and villains are rarely so easily defined. While Cianci's crimes were rooted in political corruption, the state's next case would center on a crime so violent and so public that it forced Rhode Island to confront its relationship with capital punishment. Case 6, Jason Plew. A single gunshot can change everything. September 20th, 2010, started as an ordinary morning for David Main. The 49-year-old manager of a BP gas station in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, was completing his routine end-of-shift tasks. After counting the day's receipts, he loaded $12,542 into a deposit bag and prepared to drive the short distance to Citizens Bank on Diamond Hill Road. It was a trip he had made dozens of times before without incident. But on this particular morning, someone was watching. Someone was waiting, and within minutes, David Main would become the victim of one of Rhode Island's most brutal robberies, a crime that would ignite a constitutional crisis over the death penalty and divide the state's highest officials. Jason Wayne Plew was 35 years old and already a career criminal when he walked into Kelly's Sporting Goods in Cranston the day before the robbery. His record stretched back to the 1990s. Multiple violent robberies, attempted robberies, and assaults that had earned him years in prison. In March 2000, while incarcerated, Plew had attacked a correctional officer, a crime that resulted in a 20-year sentence. He had been released on parole just months before the robbery, a decision that would prove catastrophic. On September 19th, Plew met with his co-conspirators, Jose Santiago, a 36-year-old man from Springfield, Massachusetts, who would serve as the getaway driver, and Kelly Marie LaJoie, a 35-year-old woman also from Springfield, who agreed to act as lookout. Together, they scouted the BP station on Diamond Hill Road, observing David Main's movements and the timing of his daily bank deposit. The morning of September 20th, the three arrived early. LaJoie stationed herself near the gas station, watching for the moment Main would leave. Santiago sat behind the wheel of the getaway vehicle, engine idling, ready to flee. Plew positioned himself near the bank entrance, concealed but close enough to act. Just after 9 a.m., Main exited the gas station carrying the deposit bag. He drove the short distance to Citizens Bank and pulled into the lot. As he stepped out of his vehicle and approached the bank entrance, Plew emerged from his hiding spot. What happened next was captured on surveillance cameras and witnessed by horrified bystanders. Plew drew a firearm and confronted Main, demanding the bag. Main, startled and terrified, attempted to comply. But compliance wasn't enough. Plew didn't want witnesses. He didn't want delays. He fired multiple shots at close range, striking Main in the back and head. Main collapsed on the pavement in front of the bank, the deposit bag beside him. Plew grabbed the cash and sprinted toward the waiting vehicle. Santiago accelerated away from the scene. Within moments, David Main was dead, his life taken for $12,542. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. A husband, a father figure to many in the community, a dedicated employee, gone in an instant because of greed and violence. The Woonsocket Police Department, Rhode Island State Police, and Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately launched a joint investigation. Witnesses provided descriptions of the suspect and the getaway vehicle. Surveillance footage captured Pliu's actions in chilling detail. Within days, investigators identified Pliu as the shooter. They tracked down Santiago and Lajoie shortly thereafter. On November 16, 2010, federal authorities arrested all three. Because the crime occurred outside a bank and involved robbery affecting interstate commerce, federal prosecutors determined the case fell under federal jurisdiction. And under federal law, Pliu's actions qualified for the death penalty. But Rhode Island had abolished capital punishment in 1842, becoming the first state in the nation to do so for all crimes. The state's opposition to the death penalty was deeply rooted in its history and values. When the U.S. Attorney's Office in Rhode Island filed federal charges against Pliu and announced their intent to seek a death sentence, Governor Lincoln Chafee, a vocal opponent of capital punishment, found himself facing an impossible decision. In Rhode Island, state law required the governor's approval before a defendant could be transferred to federal custody for prosecution. Chafee refused. He publicly stated that he would not allow Pliu to be handed over to federal authorities if it meant exposing him to execution. Chafee believed the death penalty was morally wrong and inconsistent with Rhode Island's values. He proposed an alternative. The Rhode Island Attorney General's office would prosecute Pliu on state charges and accept a guilty plea in exchange for life in prison without parole. Pliu, facing the certainty of a death sentence in federal court, agreed to the deal. But federal prosecutors, led by then U.S. Attorney Peter Noronha, refused to back down. They argued that the governor did not have the authority to block federal prosecution, and that Pliu's crime, committed on federal property and involving a federally insured institution, fell squarely under federal law. The Justice Department filed a motion in the First U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, seeking to compel Rhode Island to hand over Pliu. The legal battle became national news, framing the debate as a clash between state sovereignty and federal authority, between moral opposition to the death penalty and the pursuit of justice for a murdered man. On August 25, 2011, the First Circuit Court of Appeals issued a 3-2 ruling in favor of the federal government. The court held that federal prosecutors had the right to try Pliu under federal law, and that Rhode Island could not prevent his transfer. The decision was controversial, dividing legal scholars and citizens alike. Chafee, undeterred, appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. On November 7, 2011, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case, allowing the appeals court's ruling to stand. Rhode Island was legally obligated to surrender Pliu. By this point, however, the political and public pressure had shifted. Media coverage highlighted the brutality of the crime and the suffering of David Maine's family. Prosecutors, aware of the controversy, quietly began reconsidering their strategy. In July 2013, the U.S. Department of Justice announced a stunning reversal. They would withdraw their request for the death penalty. Pliu would be allowed to plead guilty in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of release. On July 31, 2013, Pliu appeared in U.S. District Court in Providence and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit robbery under the Hobbs Act robbery, and carrying, using, and discharging a firearm during and in relation to a federal crime of violence resulting in death. At the sentencing hearing on October 24, 2013, members of David Maine's family addressed the court. They described a man who had worked tirelessly to support his loved ones, who had been taken from them senselessly, and whose absence left an irreparable void. Federal prosecutors emphasized the calculated nature of the crime, the planning, the surveillance, the willingness to end a life over money. Pliu offered no substantial defense. On that day, U.S. District Court Judge William E. Smith sentenced Jason Pliu to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Jose Santiago, the getaway driver, pleaded guilty on September 5, 2013, to the same charges. On February 13, 2014, he was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Kelly Marie Lajoie, the lookout, pleaded guilty on December 9, 2011, to conspiracy, aiding and abetting robbery, and use of a firearm during a violent crime. On February 19, 2014, she was sentenced to 15.5 years in federal prison. All 3 defendants remain incarcerated today. The Plo case reshaped legal discourse around federalism and capital punishment. It demonstrated the limits of state authority when federal law is invoked. It also highlighted the moral complexities of the death penalty, showing how deeply held values can conflict with legal structures. For Governor Chafee, the case was both a political and personal ordeal. He stood by his principles, even when public opinion turned against him. For the family of David Main, no legal outcome could restore what was stolen from them, but they found some measure of closure knowing that Plo would never walk free again. Jason Plo was transferred out of Rhode Island's adult correctional institutions in November 2018 and is currently serving his life sentence in a federal facility. The case remains a defining moment in Rhode Island's modern legal history, a reminder that even in a state that rejects the death penalty, the weight of violent crime demands accountability. And as Rhode Island processed the ramifications of that conflict, another story was unfolding, one that would reveal the enduring presence of organized crime in the state. Case 7, Frank Salem and Robert DeLuca. Some secrets stay buried for decades until they don't. On March 31st, 2016, Federal Bureau of Investigation agents converged on an aging mill building on Branch Avenue in Providence's Wancook neighborhood. They weren't there for a routine inspection, acting on a tip from an unlikely source, a property owner facing his own legal troubles. They began excavating the ground behind the structure. Within hours, their shovels hit something that would crack open one of New England's most enduring mob mysteries: human remains. After 23 years, Stephen DeSero had finally been found. DeSero was 43 years old when he disappeared in May 1993. A Providence native, attorney, and real estate entrepreneur, he managed The Channel, a popular rock nightclub in South Boston that drew crowds nightly. But The Channel had a dark secret: 2 silent partners with ties to organized crime. Francis Cadillac Frank Salem, then the boss of the Patriarca crime family, and his son, Frank Jr., had hidden financial interests in the club. When federal investigators began circling, DeSero became a liability. He knew too much. And in the world of La Cosa Nostra, knowing too much is a death sentence. According to testimony that would later emerge in court, DeSero was lured to Salem's home in Sharon, Massachusetts, on May 10, 1993, under the pretense of a business meeting. Once inside, the trap was sprung. Frank Salem Jr. allegedly strangled DeSero with a garrote wire, while associate Paul Wiedek held his legs. Salem Sr. stood watch, overseeing the execution. It was methodical, calculated, and ruthless. Once DeSero was deceased, his body needed to disappear. That's where Robert Bobby DeLuca came in. DeLuca, a high-ranking capo in the Patriarca family, arranged for the disposal. He and his brother Joseph drove DeSero's remains from Massachusetts to Providence, where they buried him behind a mill building owned by William Ricci, a mob associate. The grave was shallow, the location deliberately chosen for its obscurity. For over 2 decades, the secret held. DeSero's family never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. But the mob's code of silence, omerta, seemed impenetrable. Then, in 2015, everything began unraveling. William Ricci, the mill owner, was arrested on unrelated charges involving illegal substances and firearms. Facing serious prison time, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable in the mob's glory days. He cooperated. Ricci told investigators about the body buried on his property, information he had kept hidden since 1993. The Federal Bureau of Investigation verified his claims, and the excavation began. When DeSero's remains were unearthed, dental records confirmed his identity. The case that had gone cold was suddenly very much alive. Attention immediately turned to Frank Salem. By 2016, Salem was 83 years old and living in Atlanta under witness protection. Yes, witness protection. After being convicted of racketeering in 1999, Salem had turned informant, cooperating with federal prosecutors against corrupt FBI agents and other mobsters. He had testified, served reduced time, and disappeared into anonymity. But he had never mentioned DeSero. When he learned investigators were closing in, Salem fled. He was captured days later in Connecticut, arrested and charged with witness elimination, a federal offense carrying a potential death sentence. Robert DeLuca's story was equally complicated. He too had cooperated with authorities after being arrested in 2011 entering into a plea agreement that required him to provide complete and truthful information about his mob activities. He received a sentence of just 1 day in prison, time served, in exchange for his cooperation. But like Salem, he had lied about DeSero. When confronted with new evidence in 2016, federal prosecutors charged him with obstruction and making false statements. DeLuca had violated the very plea deal that had kept him out of prison. The trial began in June 2018 in Boston's federal courthouse. Prosecutors presented a damning case built on witness testimony, forensic evidence, and the decades-long cover-up. The star witness was Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi, Salem's former best friend and longtime associate. Flemmi, himself a convicted mass offender, serving life in prison, testified that he witnessed the ending. He described watching Frank Salem Jr. strangle DeSero, while Witek held him down and Salem Sr. supervised. Flemmi's testimony was corroborated by other evidence, including statements from cooperating witnesses and the physical location of the remains. Salem's defense team argued that Flemmi was lying, motivated by a desire for leniency or revenge. They pointed out that Salem had already admitted to numerous other offenses during his cooperation with the government, so there was no reason to hide this one. But prosecutors countered that DeSero's ending was different. It involved Salem's son, and acknowledging it would have implicated someone he loved. Frank Salem Jr. had passed away from natural causes in 1995, never facing charges. By lying, Salem Sr. had protected his son's memory. On June 22, 2018, after days of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Salem and his co-defendant, Paul Witek, were both convicted of witness elimination. On September 13, 2018, U.S. District Court Judge Allison Burroughs sentenced both men to life in federal prison without the possibility of release. Salem, now 85 years old, was sent to a medical facility in Missouri. He filed multiple appeals, all of which were denied. On December 13, 2022, Francis Cadillac Frank Salem passed away in custody at the age of 89. His death marked the end of an era, the last of the old-school New England mob bosses, taken down not by rivals, but by his own lies. Robert DeLuca faced his own reckoning. After being charged with lying to federal investigators, he pleaded guilty and received additional prison time. His cooperation, once valued by prosecutors, was now tainted by deception. The man who had turned against the mob to save himself ultimately destroyed his credibility by withholding the truth about DeSero. For DeSero's family, the verdict brought a measure of closure, though the pain of his loss never faded. His son, Nick DeSero, spoke publicly after Salem's death, stating simply, "The world is better off without him. Good riddance." The case became a symbol of how even the most powerful criminal organizations eventually crumble under the weight of their own secrets. The code of silence that once defined La Cosa Nostra had been shattered by informants, cooperating witnesses, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The Salem DeLuca case also revealed the lengths to which law enforcement would go to solve cold cases. The decision by William Ricci to cooperate, the excavation of a decades-old grave, and the willingness of former mobsters to testify against their own, all of it demonstrated that in the modern era, no secret stays buried forever. And while organized crime still exists in New England, it operates as a shadow of its former self, weakened by prosecutions, informants, and the passage of time. But even as one generation of mobsters faded, another was quietly operating in Rhode Island's underworld, led by a man whose very nickname struck fear into those who knew him. Case 8, Adam Emery. Some mysteries are never solved. Some disappearances leave more questions than answers. On November 10, 1993, Adam Emery celebrated his 31st birthday in the worst possible way. He was convicted of second-degree homicide, just 3 years earlier on August 31, 1990. His life had taken a catastrophic turn. That evening, Emery, his wife Elena, and another couple were dining at a seafood stand in Rocky Point, Rhode Island, when another vehicle sideswiped his 1985 Ford Thunderbird and sped away. Enraged, Emery gave chase. His wife pointed to a dark red Ford LTD, driven by 20-year-old Jason Bass, believing it was the car that had struck them. It wasn't. But by the time Emery realized the mistake, it was too late. Emery forced Bass's vehicle to stop. He exited his car, knife in hand, given to him by Elena, and confronted the terrified young man. Bass, accompanied by his cousin Josh and a friend, had no idea why someone was pursuing him. He threw his car into reverse, trying to escape. That's when Emery struck. He plunged the knife into Bass's chest, piercing his heart. Bass was pronounced deceased at Rhode Island Hospital shortly thereafter. The investigation determined that Bass's car had not been involved in the original collision. Emery had taken the life of an innocent person over a case of mistaken identity. Emery was arrested and charged with second-degree slaying. Released on $270,000 bail posted by his family, he spent nearly 3 years awaiting trial. During that time, he maintained employment, stayed out of trouble, and appeared for all court dates. At trial, he claimed self-defense, insisting Bass had acted aggressively. But the evidence told a different story. An unarmed young man, trapped and terrified, ended by a man consumed by road rage. On November 10, 1993, the jury found Emery guilty. He faced up to life in prison. Sentencing was scheduled for 1 month later. But Adam Emery never made it to sentencing. Superior Court Justice Linda Savage made a controversial decision. She allowed Emery to remain free on bail until his sentencing hearing. Hours after the verdict, Emery and Elena left the courthouse. Witnesses observed them speaking in hushed tones. A lip reader, later hired by Rhode Island State Police, reviewed courtroom footage and concluded that Elena told her husband, "We will do what we originally said. You promised me. We should have done this before." What did this refer to? That question would haunt investigators for decades. At 3:35 p.m., the couple arrived at Kelly's Sporting Goods in Cranston. They purchased athletic socks, sweatsuits, and 80 pounds of wearable exercise weights. The salesperson later recalled that Elena seemed talkative and smiled throughout the transaction, while Adam appeared surprised by the total cost. Why would someone about to end their own life care about the price? Next, they were spotted eating at a fast food restaurant, appearing calm and unremarkable. At approximately 4:45 p.m., witnesses saw them walking along the Claiborne-Pell Newport Bridge, which spans Narragansett Bay at a height exceeding 200 feet at most points. They were later seen driving away from the bridge. But at 6:53 p.m., a call came in, an abandoned vehicle on the Newport Bridge. Police responded and found the Emery's Toyota Camry idling with the keys in the ignition, headlights on, and engine running. Inside were folded clothes on the back seat, cut-up credit cards and cash on the front seat, and Adam's driver's license. It appeared to be a carefully staged scene suggesting a joint ending. But where were their bodies? An extensive search of Narragansett Bay commenced immediately. Divers, sonar equipment, and helicopters scoured the water for days. Nothing was found. The Bass family, still reeling from Jason's loss, now feared Emery had escaped justice. Approximately 9 months later, in July 1994, a commercial fisherman pulled up his net and discovered human leg bones tangled in the mesh. Clinging to one bone was a fragment of sock identical to those purchased by the Emerys on the day they disappeared. Then, on August 30th, 1994, Elena's skull was recovered from the bay. Marine biologists determined the bones had not been submerged for the full 9 months, meaning they had been placed in the water more recently, or had been preserved elsewhere before entering the bay. DNA testing confirmed the remains belonged to Elena Emery. But Adam was never found. The discovery of Elena's remains only deepened the mystery. Had both jumped, with only her body surfacing? Had Adam convinced Elena to end her life while he escaped? Had he physically forced her off the bridge? The evidence was maddeningly ambiguous. Investigators considered multiple theories. Some believed it was a genuine pact, that both had perished, but ocean currents carried Adam's remains farther out to sea. Others suspected Adam had manipulated Elena into participating in a fake ending, knowing that her body would eventually be found and create the appearance that he too had perished. In 2004, a Rhode Island Superior Court judge declared Adam Emery legally deceased. But the Federal Bureau of Investigation never closed the case. In 2010, they placed Emery on their list of wanted fugitives, signaling their belief that he might still be alive. Over the years, numerous reported sightings emerged in Italy, in South America, in various U.S. cities. None were confirmed. The Bass family remained convinced that Adam had orchestrated an elaborate escape. Joshua Post, Jason's cousin who was in the car that night, stated publicly, "It's easier to hide with one person than with two." He believed Adam either ended Elena's life or let her perish alone so he could vanish without a partner slowing him down. Former Rhode Island State Police, Lieutenant Kevin Hopkins, who investigated the case extensively, remains uncertain. "I've seen a lot of things in my career," he said in interviews. "I wouldn't put it past it that maybe he isn't deceased. Who knows?" Yet Hopkins ultimately leans toward believing Emery passed away that night. "If I had to give you my honest opinion, I would say he was deceased. We hadn't found him, but we looked everywhere, and if he was around, we would have found him." The Federal Bureau of Investigation continues to receive tips regularly. According to spokeswoman Kristen Satera, "No matter how long it takes, the FBI will continue to work with our law enforcement partners in following every lead until we can locate fugitive Adam Emery, or his remains, and provide his victim's family with some much-needed closure." For Jason Bass's family, the lack of closure is a wound that never heals. His sisters, Cynthia and Crystal, grew up in the shadow of his ending and Emery's disappearance. Their mother, Diana, devoted her life to seeking justice for Jason, collecting newspaper clippings, and following every development in the case until her passing. The tragedy reshaped their entire family. Adam Emery's story is unlike most criminal cases. There was no trial for his disappearance, no verdict, no sentencing. Just an abandoned car, folded clothes, and a mystery that has endured for over 3 decades. Whether he lies at the bottom of Narragansett Bay or walks free somewhere under an assumed name, the truth remains elusive. And in Rhode Island, his name endures as a haunting reminder that sometimes justice slips through our fingers. While Emery's fate remains unknown, Rhode Island's next case involves a man whose long criminal career was no mystery at all. A boss who ruled with quiet authority until age finally caught up with him. Case 9, Luigi Minocchio. He was called Baby Shax, the Professor, and the Old Man. But to those who mattered, he was simply the boss. Luigi Giovanni Minocchio was born on June 23, 1927, in Providence, Rhode Island, into a world where organized crime was woven into the fabric of Federal Hill. Unlike many mobsters who flaunted their power, Minocchio operated with restraint and intelligence. Neighbors knew him as the quiet man who did crossword puzzles at the local shop. Shop owners saw him as courteous and unassuming. But beneath that calm exterior was one of the most powerful crime bosses in New England, a man who had survived decades in the underworld by staying disciplined, methodical, and invisible to law enforcement, until he couldn't hide anymore. Minocchio's criminal record stretched back to the 1940s. In 1952, at age 25, he and 2 accomplices held up a payroll truck belonging to D.R. Carner Company at gunpoint, stealing $3,800. Charged with assault, robbery, illegal possession of a firearm, and driving a stolen vehicle, Minocchio received a 5-year suspended sentence, an outcome that allowed him to avoid prison and continue his descent into organized crime. By the mid-1950s, he had aligned himself with the Patriarca crime family, then led by Raymond L.S. Patriarca. Minocchio rose steadily through the ranks, earning respect for his discretion and reliability. In April 1968, Minocchio's name became front-page news. 2 renegade bookmakers, Rudolph Marfeo and Anthony Millay, were slain in a hail of gunfire while shopping at Panone's Market in Providence's Silver Lake neighborhood. Marfeo had been targeted for defying boss Raymond Patriarca's order to shut down a gambling operation. Millay was simply in the wrong place. 6 months after the slayings, Providence police arrested Minocchio and charged him as an accessory. He was convicted in 1983 and sentenced to 2 life terms. But the case had problems. A key witness later developed Alzheimer's disease and was found to have provided false testimony in a related case. After years of legal battles that reached the U.S. Supreme Court, Minocchio struck a plea deal in December 1988. He pleaded no contest to conspiracy, and his sentence was reduced to the 2.5 years he had already served. He walked free, and his underworld prestige soared. By the mid-1990s, Minocchio had climbed to the top. After Francis Cadillac Frank, Salem, was indicted on racketeering charges in 1995, Minocchio became the boss of the Patriarca family. He ran operations from a laundromat on Federal Hill, overseeing traditional mob rackets, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and stolen goods. Despite intense surveillance by the Rhode Island State Police and FBI, Minocchio managed to avoid major legal trouble for years. Wiretapped conversations caught associates referring to him simply as that guy, a sign of respect and fear. In 2008, Minocchio's luck began to run out. FBI Special Agents Joseph Dignan and Jeffrey Cady approached him while he was dining at a Federal Hill restaurant. Investigators had seen something incriminating: Minocchio accepting an envelope full of cash, traced back to a Providence strip club. The money was an extortion payment. For years, Minocchio and his associates had been shaking down adult entertainment establishments, including the Cadillac Lounge and Satin Doll, demanding monthly tribute in exchange for protection. The scheme had generated hundreds of thousands, possibly over $1 million, during Minocchio's tenure as boss. In January 2011, as part of a massive nationwide crackdown on organized crime, Minocchio was arrested while boarding a plane in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He was 83 years old. Federal prosecutors charged him with racketeering conspiracy, extortion, and multiple related offenses. The indictment detailed how Minocchio, as the head of La Cosa Nostra in New England, had used fear and his position to coerce club owners into paying protection money. Some club employees were mob-connected themselves, ensuring compliance from the inside. Minocchio's arrest marked a turning point. By May 2011, the Patriarca family was a shadow of its former self, weakened by prosecutions, informants, and generational decline. Omerta, the code of silence that had once made the mob untouchable, had collapsed. Associates were flipping and testifying against one another. Minocchio, the old-school mobster who had learned at the knee of Raymond Patriarca, now found himself in a world he no longer recognized. On February 22, 2012, facing overwhelming evidence, Minocchio changed his plea. He admitted guilt to one count of racketeering conspiracy, acknowledging his role as former boss of the Patriarca crime family and his oversight of the extortion activities. In exchange, prosecutors dropped the extortion charges. On May 11, 2012, U.S. District Court Judge William E. Smith sentenced Minocchio to 66 months, 5.5 years, in federal prison. At sentencing, Minocchio addressed the court, reading from a prepared statement. "By virtue of my position, I inherited the deeds of my associates," he said. "I simply do not want my family and my friends to think that I personally threatened anyone." But Assistant U.S. Attorney William Furland countered that Minocchio's reputation alone was enough. He didn't need to issue explicit threats. His status as boss carried implicit menace. When a strip club operator decided to stop making payments, Minocchio simply paid him a visit. That visit was enough. Minocchio served his sentence at a low-security federal facility in North Carolina. He was released in 2015 at age 88, spending his final months under house arrest in his old Federal Hill apartment. After his release, he moved to the Rhode Island Veterans Home in Bristol. On December 8, 2024, Luigi Baby Shacks Minocchio passed away at age 97. His death marked the end of an era. He was the last Providence-based boss of the Patriarca family, the final link to the mob's golden age. Former Rhode Island State Police Superintendent Stephen O'Donnell reflected, "He's probably the most powerful boss out of Rhode Island since Raymond L.S. Patriarca Sr." For decades, Minocchio had navigated a world of violence and deception, outlasting rivals, prosecutors, and time itself. But in the end, even the most cunning mobster couldn't escape the law forever. Case 10, Frank Marapese. Some men are born into violence, others choose it. Frank Bobo Marapese did both. Born in Providence, Marapese came of age during the golden era of New England organized crime, when the Patriarca family controlled vast illegal activity across the region. By the 1960s and 70s, Marapese had earned a reputation as one of the family's most feared enforcers. A man built like a bulldog and ruthless in action. "People soil their pants when they hear my name," he was once recorded saying during a wiretapped conversation. It wasn't an empty boast. On March 15, 1975, Richard Dickey Calais visited the Acorn Social Club on Federal Hill, a mob hangout owned by Marapese's father. It was the last place Calais would ever go. According to court testimony, Marapese and others confronted Calais inside the club. He was shot multiple times and stabbed repeatedly. "It was kind of crazy the way they ended him," retired Rhode Island State Police Captain Brian Andrews later recalled. "Rather than just typical mob fashion, where they put a bullet in the back of your head." Calais' body was found near a golf course in Rehoboth, riddled with wounds. Maripes was a prime suspect, but proving it took over a decade. In 1987, he was convicted for his role in Calais' slaying and sentenced to prison. He served 25 years in Rhode Island's adult correctional institutions. When he was released on parole in 2008, at age 65, he returned to the only life he knew. Within months, he had resumed his involvement in organized crime. In fall 2010, the Rhode Island State Police Intelligence Unit launched an investigation into an illegal sports gambling operation run by Vincent Big Vinny Tallow, a longtime mob associate operating out of Johnston. Detectives monitored thousands of phone conversations and conducted physical surveillance. The operation was substantial, accepting illegal bets on professional and college sporting events, arranging payouts, and collecting debts. As investigators dug deeper, they identified key figures directing the enterprise: Edward Lotto, a senior member of the Patriarca family, and Frank Maripes. When authorities learned Maripes was overseeing the criminal operation, they obtained a court-authorized wiretap on his cellular telephone. The recordings were damning. Maripes used his standing as a made member of the Patriarca crime family to direct extortion and loan sharking activities. Victims ranged from legitimate business owners to individuals who had incurred gambling debts. The implicit threat was clear: you either paid, or you faced consequences from one of the mob's most feared enforcers. On May 6, 2011, Rhode Island State Police executed a massive sweep. 24 individuals with ties to organized crime were arrested, including 3 top-ranking Patriarca officials: Maripes, Lotto, and Alfred Chippy Civila. Rhode Island Attorney General Peter Kilmartin stated, "What today proves is that organized crime and corruption in the state of Rhode Island never sleeps." Captain James Demers added, 3 of the top-ranking officials from the Patriarca organized crime family were arrested today. I think we made a big dent. Maripes was charged with racketeering, conspiracy to commit extortion, and conspiracy to commit usury. The evidence was overwhelming: recorded conversations, witness testimony, and documentation of the criminal enterprise. Most troubling was his status. At the time of his arrest, Maripes was on lifetime parole for the 1987 slaying. He had been free for less than 3 years before returning to crime. On November 20th, 2013, Maripes appeared in Providence Superior Court and pleaded guilty to 1 count of racketeering, 5 counts of conspiracy to commit extortion, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit usury. Justice William Carnes sentenced him to 9 years in prison. Maripes, now 70 years old, was credited with time served for the 2.5 years he had spent in custody since his arrest. He was returned to the adult correctional institutions in Cranston, the same facility where he had spent a quarter century for his previous conviction. Maripes' health began deteriorating during his incarceration. He suffered from heart problems, exacerbated by age and decades of stress. On September 15, 2017, he applied for parole. The Rhode Island Parole Board denied his request. Maripes would have been eligible to reapply in 18 months, but he never got the chance. On December 22, 2017, just 3 months after his parole denial, Frank "Bobo" Maripes was transported to Rhode Island Hospital for unspecified treatment. He passed away there at the age of 74. Rhode Island State Police Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Philbin confirmed the passing, stating he was the real deal. Captain Brian Andrews, who had investigated Maripes for years, reflected. He was gruff, that's just the way he was. He was big physically. He was built like a bulldog. He was wild. He was dangerous. Maripes' death marked another milestone in the decline of New England organized crime. The Patriarca family, once a dominant force, had been reduced to a fractured network of aging mobsters and small-time operators. Federal prosecutions and cooperating witnesses had gutted the organization. Yet even in death, Maripes' reputation endured. To law enforcement, he represented criminals who refused rehabilitation, returning to crime despite imprisonment. To former associates, he was a symbol of loyalty and toughness, a man who never cooperated and died behind bars, rather than betray the family. Frank "Bobo" Maripes lived by the sword, and he died by it. Not in a hail of bullets, but in a hospital bed, a prisoner until his final breath. For Rhode Island, his passing closed another chapter in the state's long relationship with organized crime.